Forget everything you thought you knew about drug cartels, or at least what the glossy TV series about Pablo Escobar and Medellin told you. In the shadow of that war, now relegated to history, upon the ruins of old empires, a force far more sinister than the eccentric antics of El Patron matured silently and methodically. Imagine a place where the horizon blurs between the emerald green of banana plantations and the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea. This is the Urabá region, the geographical isthmus connecting South America with Central America, a strategic aorta of the continent. For tourists, it might be paradise, but for the local inhabitants, this place has been synonymous with a mass grave for decades. It is here, in this land soaked in humidity and blood, that a monster was born, one that rewrote the rules of the game, transforming drug trafficking from a bandit activity into a militarized corporation of death. This is not the story of the narco-terrorism of the 90s. It is the dawn of the paramilitary 2.0 era, the era of the Clan del Golfo. To comprehend the nature of this monster, one must travel back to the mid-2000s, a time the official Bogotá administration hailed as a triumph of democracy, but which actually proved to be the greatest deception in Colombia's modern history. From 2003 through 2006, President Álvaro Uribe's government engaged in negotiations with the AUC, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. This was an immensely powerful far-right army, initially created to combat leftist FARC guerrillas, but which had long since morphed into a colossal cocaine exporting machine. Under the Justice and Peace Agreement, over 30,000 AUC combatants laid down their arms, believing the promises of amnesty and reintegration. Cameras broadcast images of hardened men in camouflage handing over rifles and shaking hands with officials. It seemed the war was over. But it was an illusion. The disarmament didn't bring peace. It created a power vacuum, a black hole that immediately began to suck in the cruelest, most avaricious, and unprincipled predators left at large. As the AUC's top leaders prepared for extradition to the United States, their mid-level command, field commanders, accountants, and security chiefs, realized something crucial. The cocaine market hadn't disappeared. The competition had merely dwindled. At the heart of this chaos was a figure far removed from the charismatic leader archetype. Daniel Rendón Herrera, known in the criminal underworld as Don Mario, possessed neither Escobar's public notoriety nor the political weight of his brother, the legendary paramilitary commander Freddy Rendón, nicknamed El Alemán, the German. Don Mario was a man of numbers, a gray eminence who had spent years controlling the finances of the Bloc Elmer Cardenas, one of the AUC's wealthiest units. When his brother Freddy, bound by a code of honor or perhaps political naivete, accepted demobilization and imprisonment, Don Mario chose a different path. He vanished into the Urabá jungle, taking with him not only millions of dollars in cash, but also the most valuable assets, contact lists, routes, and, most importantly, the loyalty of hundreds of fighters who knew nothing but killing and had no desire to return to the poverty of peasant life. For Don Mario, the ideological struggle against communism, the banner under which the AUC had marched, became an obsolete relic. He saw the future clearly, pure business, protected by military discipline. In 2006, as the official demobilization still echoed in the news, Rendón Herrera began gathering the fragments of the disbanded units. He offered former paramilitaries what the state could not, a stable salary, weapons, and power. Thus, the organization he cynically named Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia, AGC, Gaitanist Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, was born. Employing the name of Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, a liberal martyr and idol of the poor, was the height of hypocrisy for a far-right group, but it was a calculated public relations move. Don Mario sought to lend his drug cartel a political veneer, creating leverage for future negotiations with power. However, the methods used to construct this new structure were far from political. It was terror in its purest, most distilled form. To consolidate his grip on the Urabá region, the gateway for cocaine trafficking into the Caribbean Sea, Don Mario unleashed a bloody purge. He didn't just eliminate enemies, he annihilated former AUC comrades who refused to join his new venture or attempted to operate independently. Throughout 2007 and 2008, dozens of bodies bearing signs of torture were discovered in the jungles and villages of the Antioquia and Córdoba departments. It was a message. The old hierarchy was dead. Now there was only one boss. Don Mario introduced a rigid corporate structure where each front or unit was responsible for a specific territory and paid a tax to the central command. He transformed the gang into a holding company where murder became a routine administrative procedure. By 2008, it became evident that the state had been dealt a severe blow. Instead of disorganized gangs squabbling over the remnants of the pie, a monolith had grown in Urabá. Don Mario controlled the coastal outlets through which tons of white powder departed on speedboats toward Central America and the United States. He corrupted local police forces wholesale, and those who refused the bribes were found dead by the roadside. His men, now calling themselves Urabeños, inhabitants of Urabá, effectively became the authority in the region. They imposed curfews, settled domestic disputes, and collected a security tax from every legal activity, from small shops to farms. This was not merely a resurgence of paramilitarism, it was its mutation. If atrocities had previously been justified by the fight against FARC partisans, violence now served solely the maximization of profit. Don Mario created the prototype for what the Clan del Golfo would become, a perfectly oiled mechanism where military power served drug trafficking and drug trafficking financed military power. The spiral of violence began to accelerate with renewed force, and soon all of Colombia trembled, realizing that ideological wars had given way to an era of total criminal pragmatism where human life was worth less than a kilogram of cocaine paste. And this was merely the beginning of the rise of an organization that would soon force the state to question who truly controlled the country. The events of May 2008 served as the detonator that definitively shattered the fragile balance of power within the Colombian criminal world. Overnight, Álvaro Uribe's government, seeking to demonstrate resolve to Washington, extradited 14 top AUC leaders, including heavyweights like Salvatore Mancuso, to the United States. The images of warlords in handcuffs boarding a DEA plane were broadcast as a symbol of justice's victory. But on the ground, in the dusty villages of Antioquia and Córdoba, the event was perceived differently. It was the signal for the start of the massacre. The power vacuum created by the disappearance of the Godfathers instantly transformed the country into a chessboard where the pieces were moved not by grandmasters, but by butchers. Daniel Rendón Herrera, that same Don Mario, understood that the time for diplomacy was over. He was no longer just an accountant or a gray eminence. He now claimed the crown as king of all cocaine trafficking along the Caribbean coast. But he was not the only one vying for this throne. Don Mario's ambitions clashed with the interests of other predators, survivors of the Darwinian selection process of the post-demobilization chaos. His primary adversary became the group Los Rastrojos, the armed wing of the Norte del Valle cartel. While Don Mario's men, now calling themselves Urabeños, relied on a military structure and the, albeit false, ideology of former paramilitaries, the Rastrojos were pure mercenaries, professional killers with no political pretensions. The war between them erupted with such fury that homicide statistics in the Antioquia department surged by tens of percentage points within months. It was a battle for the corridors, invisible lines on maps traversing jungles and mangroves, along which tons of cocaine flowed toward the sea. Whoever controlled the corridor controlled life itself. Don Mario opted for a tactic of total intimidation, which could be defined as a scorched earth strategy. His militiamen didn't limit themselves to shootouts with competitors. They descended upon villages they believed were collaborating with Los Rastrojos, or the Oficina de Envigado, heirs to Pablo Escobar's empire, organizing demonstrative executions. The victims' bodies were often left in central squares or along roadsides with signs accusing them of betrayal. In the rural areas of Urabá and Córdoba, the practice of dismemberment with chainsaws, a macabre legacy from the 90s, returned, designed to sow primal terror among the peasants. The logic was simple. Fear is a more reliable currency than money. If the population fears you more than the police or your competitors, they will remain silent, hide your shipments, and feed your soldiers. Don Mario paid his hitmen 2 million pesos per month, enormous sums for a poor province, transforming murder into the most prestigious profession in the region. In the cities, the tactics shifted. Here, the Urabeños employed urban guerrilla warfare and sleeper cell methods. In Medellin, Monteria, and Barranquilla, grenades began exploding in bars and nightclubs belonging to competitors. Don Mario introduced the puntos system, informants positioned on every street corner, from cigarette vendors to taxi drivers, reporting every movement of police or strangers. It was a comprehensive espionage network that turned cities into panopticons, where every step was monitored by the cartel's invisible eyes. By the end of 2008, the organization controlled over 1,000 well-armed combatants, and cocaine exports through the ports of Turbo and Nicocli reached industrial scales. According to intelligence data, Don Mario oversaw the shipment of up to 10 tons of cocaine each month, collecting a tax, impuesto al gramaje, on every batch passing through his territory, even if the merchandise belonged to other groups. He became not just a narco-baron, but a gatekeeper, without whose permission no kilogram could leave Colombia's northern coast. To legitimize his power in the eyes of the local populace and mask his criminal essence, Don Mario actively utilized the Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia, AGC brand. In his communiques, disseminated via the internet and leaflets, he declared his organization the people's sole defense against FARC guerrillas and state arbitrariness. He styled himself a political leader, demanding recognition as a belligerent party. However, behind this rhetoric lay a cynical reality. The AGC fought less against leftist partisans and more often collaborated with them where it served business interests, exchanging cocaine paste for weapons or passage through territories. Ideology was definitively dead, replaced by the pragmatism of profit. The state could not ignore this abscess indefinitely. Don Mario became target number one for the Colombian police. A reward of 5 billion pesos, approximately $2.5 million, was offered for information leading to his location. The hunt for him became an obsession for General Oscar Naranjo, then director of the National Police. Intelligence services deployed all resources, from intercepting satellite phones to infiltrating informants into the narco-baron's inner circle. The net tightened slowly but inexorably. Don Mario, sensing the pursuit, grew paranoid. He ceased using phones, communicating only through couriers, and constantly changed his sleeping locations, moving through the jungle accompanied by an elite unit of bodyguards. The epilogue arrived on the night of the 15th of April, 2009. An elite police unit, Jungla, supported by helicopters, launched an assault on a farm in the rural area of the municipality of Nicocli, in the heart of the Urabá region. The operation was swift. Don Mario, the man who instilled terror in half the country, was caught off guard. When special forces stormed his hideout, they found not a heavily armed commander ready to die in battle, but a weary man hiding under a palm tree, eating rice from a plastic plate. His personal guard, numbering around 50 individuals, was neutralized or fled. Don Mario's arrest was broadcast on all television channels as a grand government success. A beaming President Uribe declared that the Urabeños were finished and that the backbone of drug trafficking had been broken. The media was flooded with headlines proclaiming the end of an era, and analysts predicted the swift disintegration of the organization into small gangs that the police would easily dismantle. But this optimism was a fatal error. The authorities, blinded by the brilliance of their victory, failed to notice that figures far more dangerous and cunning had long been growing in Don Mario's shadow. By decapitating the organization, the police had merely accelerated its evolution. The founder's arrest did not destroy the structure. Instead, it passed the reins into the hands of the Usuga clan, individuals who had attended the school not only of far-right paramilitaries, but also of leftist guerrillas, people who knew everything about warfare. In the Urabá jungle, As the helicopter carried Don Mario away to Bogotá, the new kings were already preparing for their coronation, Juan de Dios and Dairo Antonio Usuga, and they had no intention of repeating their predecessors' mistakes. Instead of chaos, they would bring military order to the narco-business, transforming the gang into an indestructible corporation. The illusion of victory, which the government so desperately wanted to believe after Don Mario's arrest, dissolved faster than the morning mist over the Urabá jungle. The authorities committed the classic mistake of confusing the elimination of a leader with the destruction of the structure, unaware that their actions had merely triggered the mechanism of natural selection, bringing predators of a completely different order to the throne. Power passed into the hands of the Usuga clan, a family whose biography reads like a condensed course in Colombian violence history. Brothers Juan de Dios Usuga, known by the battle name Giovanni, and Dairo Antonio Usuga, the future king of cocaine Otoniel, were no common bandits. They were veterans who had passed through a monstrous survival school. In their youth, they had fought in the ranks of the Maoist Popular Liberation Army, EPL guerrillas, then with cynical ease shifted their ideology, joining their enemies, the far-right paramilitaries of the AUC. This unique experience made them ideal war machines. They mastered partisan tactics of ambushes and mines, while also possessing the cruelty and organizational capabilities of punitive squads. Under the leadership of the Usuga brothers, the gang, which authorities contemptuously called Los Urabeños, began a rapid mutation. Giovanni, assuming military command, and Otoniel, responsible for strategy and finances, abandoned chaotic banditry in favor of a rigid military hierarchy. They began building not merely a cartel, but a true shadow army. For the first time in the history of Colombian drug trafficking, hitmen were offered a social package, a fixed salary reaching 2 million pesos, material assistance to the families of the fallen, and even a form of pension. Rigorous discipline was introduced in training camps, mandating the wearing of camouflage uniforms with AGC insignia and the study of the statute, which regulated everything from combat rules to behavior with the civilian population. Drunkenness on duty or unauthorized robbery carried the penalty of a bullet to the back of the head. This militarization of the narco-business transformed a rabble of cutthroats into an elite assault infantry capable of facing the regular army on equal terms. From 2009 to 2011, the Usuga brothers waged a campaign of terror aimed at the total cleansing of territories from competitors and the establishment of absolute social control. In the Córdoba department, which became their new fiefdom, they revived the practice of social cleansing, limpieza social. Death squads stormed villages at night, methodically exterminating all deemed undesirable elements. Petty thieves, drug addicts, prostitutes, and, naturally, police informants. It was a perverse form of justice intended not only to intimidate the population, but also to win the loyalty of conservative peasants weary of street crime. Bodies were found in the morning with notes. A GC brings order here. Concurrently, Giovanni waged a ruthless war against the remnants of the Los Rastrojos cartel, driving them out of the gold mining areas in the Bajo Cauca region. Rivers literally turned red. The bodies of slain enemies were often thrown into the water for the current to carry away, depriving relatives even of the right to a funeral. By 2011, it became clear that the Usuga brothers had created a state within a state. They controlled not only drug trafficking, but also illegal gold mining, which, amid rising global precious metal prices, began yielding profits comparable to cocaine. Excavators tearing up riverbeds in the jungle were guarded by men with Galil rifles, with the same zeal as coca processing labs. The police, realizing the scale of the threat, launched a veritable hunt for Giovanni. Juan de Dios Usuga was the engine of the clan's military expansion, its most aggressive and dangerous commander. Intelligence tracked him for months, analyzing fragments of information from informants until finally obtaining the exact coordinates of his refuge. On the night of January 1st, 2012, while the entire country was still celebrating New Year's Eve, an elite Special Forces unit, Yungla, landed by helicopter at a ranch in the municipality of Acandi Choco department, Giovanni, celebrating with his inner circle, had no intention of surrendering. A fierce firefight ensued, lasting several hours. According to testimonies from operation participants, the narco baron returned fire until the last cartridge, covering his men's retreat, and was killed in action. The photograph of his bloodied body, sprawled in the mud, circled all the country's newspapers. The authorities, once again, as in Don Mario's case, rushed to declare victory, calling it a fatal blow to the cartel. President Juan Manuel Santos personally congratulated the police on eliminating one of Latin America's most wanted criminals. However, the Klan's response to their leader's death was unlike anything Colombia had seen since the days of Pablo Escobar. Otoniel, assuming sole command, did not hide or flee. He declared war. A few days after his brother's death, in early January 2012, the Clan del Golfo distributed leaflets announcing an Aramed strike and paro armado. It was an unprecedented act of defiance against the state. Militiamen blocked roads in the departments of Antioquia, Choco, Córdoba, Sucre, and Magdalena. Anyone daring to open a shop, operate a bus route, or simply venture onto the street risked death. Northern Colombia plunged into paralysis. Cities became ghost towns. Schools and hospitals closed. Transportation halted. Shop shelves emptied. Those who attempted to violate the ban were brutally punished. Militiamen burned dozens of buses and trucks directly on the roads. Drivers were beaten or killed on the spot. The economic damage was calculated in millions of dollars daily. For the first time in many years, a criminal group demonstrated the ability to halt life in a vast region of the country, showing that true power over these lands belonged not to the president in Bogotá, but to the man in the jungle. The Paro Armado of 2012 became a turning point. It proved that the Clan del Golfo had transcended the level of a mere criminal organization, transforming into a politico-military force capable of holding millions of citizens hostage. Otoniel emerged from his brother's shadow to become Colombia's most dangerous man, and his reign had just begun. After the smoke from the burning tires during the 2012 armed strike dissipated, and Dairo Antonio Usuga, now the sole ruler of the empire, known as Otoniel, became the undisputed leader, he grasped a fundamental truth. The old drug cartel model, built on Pablo Escobar's rigid hierarchy, was no longer viable. Attempting to personally control every corner of the country meant placing his neck under the executioner's axe. Otoniel, possessing peasant cunning and the strategic thinking of a partisan, revolutionized criminal management, introducing a model that experts would later call criminal franchising. From 2012 to 2015, the Clan del Golfo ceased being merely a gang and transformed into a networked octopus, offering local groups its brand, logistics, and force support in exchange for loyalty and a share of the profits. It was a brilliant and sinister scheme. Any street gang in a remote region was invited to identify as an AGC cell, gain access to wholesale cocaine shipments and heavy weaponry. But in return, they were obligated to adhere to the statute and remit a quota of their racket and trafficking proceeds to the center. The clan grew like a cancerous tumor, engulfing smaller predators and incorporating them into its organism, while Otoniel himself remained in the shadows, protected by dozens of layers of intermediaries. The cartel's economic base also underwent radical diversification. Cocaine remained king, but Otoniel quickly understood that dictating terms in only one market was risky. In the jungles of the Choco and Antioquia departments, the roar of heavy machinery echoed. The Clan del Golfo launched a massive expansion into illegal gold mining. Yellow gold proved the ideal complement to white gold. It is easier to launder, carries lower prison risks and profits amid soaring global metal prices, sometimes surpassed drug revenues. Excavators tearing up riverbeds were guarded by men with assault rifles with the same jealousy as drug labs, and the local population was forced to work in the mines for meager wages. Simultaneously, the extortion racket escalated to a new level. Now, the security tax was paid not only by drug traffickers, but also by legitimate businesses. from small shop owners to transnational corporations extracting coal or cultivating bananas. The clan became an invisible shareholder in the region's economy, collecting tribute on every peso that flowed through controlled territories. Criminal globalization under Otoniel's leadership reached industrial scales. The port of Turbo in the Gulf of Urabá transformed into the primary gateway for cocaine trafficking to Europe. It was here that the logistical chain connecting Colombian jungles with the ports of Rotterdam and Antwerp was perfected. The Clan del Golfo forged strategic alliances with the world's most powerful criminal syndicates. Emissaries from Mexico's Sinaloa cartel became frequent visitors to Otoniel's camps, arranging supplies of tons of powder northward, while Italy's Ndrangheta ensured the reception and distribution of the merchandise in Europe. Cocaine was hidden in containers with bananas within the cavities of construction machinery, impregnated into clothing and plastics. The smugglers' inventiveness knew no bounds, and supply volumes were measured in hundreds of tons annually. The Clan del Golfo became the guarantor of stability in the global drug market, a reliable supplier that always fulfilled its obligations, regardless of pressure from authorities. However, behind the facade of a successful economic empire lay monstrous cruelty, manifested most vividly in the battle for Buenaventura, Colombia's main Pacific port. This city, strategically vital for access to Asian markets, became the arena for a ruthless war between the Clan del Golfo and the local group La Empresa. To break competitor resistance and intimidate the population, Otoniel's men introduced a practice that chilled even seasoned police officers. In the port's impoverished neighborhoods, built on stilts over the water, casas de pique, slaughterhouses, appeared. These were specially equipped shacks where captured enemies, or simply those refusing to pay tribute, were dragged at night. Living people were dismembered with machetes and axes, often accompanied by loud music to drown out screams. Body parts were then thrown into the sea during low tide, allowing nature to conceal the crime scenes. The Casa de Pique became the symbol of absolute dehumanization. Terror transformed into a routine management technology where the human body was merely flesh to be disposed of to maintain control over drug trafficking. By 2015, the Clan del Golfo controlled not only routes and mines, but fear itself, which had become the primary law in its territories of influence. By 2015, it was evident that the metastases launched by the Clan del Golfo into the Colombian state's organism could not be removed by targeted arrests. Otoniel's organization had grown so large that it began to threaten the very concept of national sovereignty in the northern regions. In response, Bogotá sanctioned the launch of Operation Agamemnon, the largest, most expensive, and technically complex police mission since the hunt for Pablo Escobar. This was not a mere raid, but a full-scale military invasion into the heart of darkness, the Urabá region. More than 1,000 elite Special Forces fighters, supported by a flotilla of Black Hawk helicopters and state-of-the-art radio-electronic reconnaissance systems, began methodically combing every square kilometer of jungle, tightening the noose around the elusive leader. The objective was singular: capture Otoniel dead or alive, decapitating the hydra suffocating the country. However, Dairo Antonio Usuga had no intention of playing the role of a cornered victim. In response to state pressure, he played a card covered by the dust of the Medellin cartel era, reviving the sinister Plan Pistola, pistol plan. Otoniel declared an open hunting season on uniformed personnel, setting a fixed bounty for murder, 2 million pesos, or about $700, for the head of any police officer. This order turned the streets of Monteria, Cartagena, and Caucasia into shooting ranges. Young hitmen, blinded by the lure of easy money, shot at patrol cars at traffic lights, killed officers leaving their homes, and detonated grenades near police stations. It was an asymmetric war designed to demoralize law enforcement, forcing them to fear their own shadows. The Clan del Golfo demonstrated that even thousands of special forces, troops in the jungle, could not protect a single sergeant in the city, and the terror could reach anyone wearing a green uniform. Otoniel himself transformed into a phantom during these years. Aware that technology was a trap, he completely abandoned the use of cellular communication and the internet, reverting communication methods to the 19th century. Orders were transmitted exclusively through a complex network of couriers, often miners, who carried notes, messages by motorcycle or on foot, passing them hand to hand. This analog firewall drove American DEA agents and British intelligence officers mad. They could intercept any digital signal, but were powerless against a piece of paper in a teenager's pocket. The life of the world's most powerful narco-baron ceased resembling the luxurious daily routine of his predecessors. No villas, pools, or parties. Otoniel lived like a hunted beast, constantly moving between dozens of deep jungle huts, never sleeping in the same place twice. His paranoia reached clinical dimensions, but it was precisely this paranoia that saved his life. This was not merely the satisfaction of lust, but a demonstration of the feudal lord's absolute power, possessing the right of the first night over the subjugated population. The Clan del Golfo didn't just trade drugs, it turned human dignity into merchandise and the most defenseless into consumables for its leader's pleasure. Operation Agamemnon continued, tightening the noose, but the cornered beast only grew more dangerous, its appetites escalating, demanding new victims and new markets. As Dairo Antonio Usuga, cornered by Operation Agamemnon, was forced to change his jungle bedding more often than his socks, his criminal empire demonstrated frightening adaptability, discovering a resource even more profitable than cocaine and safer than illegal gold. Between 2017 and 2019, the Clan del Golfo underwent a cynical corporate transformation, converting the Western Hemisphere's greatest humanitarian catastrophe into an assembly line for extracting super profits. This involved controlling the Darien Gap, Tapón del Darién, an impenetrable strip of jungle and swamp separating Colombia and Panama. This place, considered a green tomb for any traveler for centuries, became the only land route to the American dream for hundreds of thousands of desperate people. And the Clan del Golfo installed its turnstile on this road, beginning to collect payment for the right to risk one's life. Geopolitical cataclysms, earthquakes in Haiti, economic collapse in Venezuela, wars in Africa and the Middle East, pushed waves of migrants across South America. All these flows, funneling like an hourglass, converged on the tiny Colombian port of Necoclí, on the shores of the Gulf of Urabá. It was here that AGC militiamen deployed a logistical hub for the trade in human hopes. They didn't just observe the flow, they structured it, monopolized it, and taxed it. No migrant, whether Cuban, Cameroonian, or Venezuelan, could set foot on the path leading to Panama without paying tribute to the cartel. It was a perfectly oiled racket system, the boatmen transporting people across the Gulf to the jungle's edge, the guide, coyotes, the equipment vendors, all worked for the clan or paid it the lion's share of their earnings. The cost of the ticket for this inferno varied based on the migrant's origin and solvency, but averaged hundreds of dollars per person. Those attempting to pass independently, bypassing cartel checkpoints, disappeared without a trace. Their bodies became part of the jungle ecosystem, serving as a warning to others. The Clan del Golfo introduced an identification system eerily reminiscent of all-inclusive resorts. Migrants were given colored wristbands or stickers on their clothes, indicating which service package had been paid for and which group that cargo belonged to. This transformed living people into depersonalized merchandise, into crates of flesh to be moved from point A to point B. The economics of this process were staggering. Unlike cocaine, which must be grown, processed, and hidden from police, migrants brought money directly into the bandits' hands, moved on their own, and were not subject to confiscation. The risks were minimal and the profits colossal. Daily, millions of dollars in cash passed through the hands of militiamen, immediately laundered through the local economy or invested in weapons purchases. However, behind the dry profit figures lay a reality of absolute nightmare. The Darien Gap, under the Clan del Golfo's management, transformed into a zone where the laws of humanity did not apply. Sexual violence became not an executor's excess, but a systemic tool for control and additional profit. Women and girls lacking the funds for the passage fee paid with their bodies. Gang rapes in the jungle became routine, with survivors preferring silence upon reaching the United States. Cartel militiamen, feeling impunity, robbed migrant groups even after they had paid for safe passage, taking phones, final savings, and even shoes. They knew these people were ghosts, had no rights, and no one would look for them. The Clan del Golfo effectively privatized the border. They regulated the flow, opening and closing the floodgates depending on authorities' attention or weather conditions. When tens of thousands of people accumulated in Necoclí awaiting boats, it created a humanitarian crisis that the cartel used as leverage against the government. By 2019, Otoniel's organization had become the primary guardian of the United States' southern border, albeit thousands of kilometers from Texas. They controlled the most difficult and dangerous stretch of the route, and anyone wishing to reach North America by land inevitably became a client of the Klan. This new market allowed the cartel not only to offset losses from police raids on drug labs, but also to significantly expand its influence. The money from human trafficking went to bribe officials in Panama and Colombia, ensuring the uninterrupted operation of the Green Corridor. Furthermore, migration flows were used as an ideal cover for drug transport. Cocaine was hidden in migrants' backpacks, forcing them to act as mules under threat of death to their children. The fusion of narco-business and human trafficking created a hybrid criminal economy, resistant to traditional methods of combating it. The Clan del Golfo proved capable of monetizing even human desperation, transforming one of the planet's wildest points into a high-yield enterprise fueled by blood and tears. While the world recoiled at photos of emaciated refugees emerging from the Darien mud, Otoniel's headquarters counted profits, realizing they had found an inexhaustible source of income independent of coca harvests. By 2020, the sense of omnipotence derived from millions of dollars from human trafficking and cocaine began to play a cruel trick on the cartel's leadership. Dairo Antonio Usuga, confined within the green prison of his own domains, became a paranoid hermit whose life depended on the loyalty of a handful of people weary of living like hunted beasts. The hunt for the ghost entered its final surgically precise phase, codenamed Operation Osiris. This was no longer a simple police raid, but an extremely complex geopolitical poker game where the stakes were placed not only in Bogotá but also in Washington and London. The American DEA and British intelligence, providing advanced radio location technology, managed the impossible. They breached Otoniel's analog firewall. Satellites and reconnaissance aircraft began registering anomalies in courier movements in the Karaoke mountain range area in the Antioquia department, narrowing the search radius to a specific jungle square. But the decisive factor was not technology, but betrayal, the eternal currency of the criminal world. Members of Otoniel's inner security circle, tempted by the reward and witness protection program, handed over their boss's coordinates. The dawn of October 23, 2021, in the municipality of Necoclí was ripped apart by the roar of helicopter blades. Operation Osiris, in its scale, overshadowed everything Colombia had witnessed in the 21st century. 22 Black Hawk assault helicopters rose into the sky, landing a contingent of 500 elite Army and Jungla police unit fighters directly onto the narco baron's guards. It was a total blockade. Marines sealed off rivers to cut off water escape routes, and aviation controlled every gap in the foliage. Otoniel was protected by 8 security rings, the famous Anillos, composed of the most experienced cutthroats, ready to die for their master. But the surprise and force of the strike paralyzed the defense system. The elite bodyguards were either destroyed by sniper fire or scattered by massive aerial assaults. The epilogue arrived around noon. The man who had held an entire nation in fear for years did not accept a final battle, unlike his brother Giovanni. Otoniel was found hiding in the bushes, unarmed, wearing rubber boots and a sweat-soaked t-shirt. As special forces threw him to the ground, a strange, almost childlike smile froze on the face of the planet's most wanted criminal. A grimace of nervous breakdown, or perhaps relief that the endless flight had finally ended. "I am Otoniel," he uttered, raising his hands. This moment marked the culmination of a decade-long hunt. President Iván Duque immediately compared this arrest to the fall of Pablo Escobar, declaring the end of the clan, but reality, as always, proved more complex than the television image. The arrest of the king did not mean the death of the kingdom. It was merely the beginning of a complex legal and political game. Finding himself in the prosecutor's bunker in Bogotá, Otoniel changed tactics. Realizing that a concrete coffin awaited him in the USA's ADX Florence prison, he attempted to play the political actor card. The narco baron declared his readiness to cooperate with the Truth Commission, JEP, a body established to investigate crimes of the Civil War. Otoniel began giving testimonies that sent a cold shiver down the Colombian establishment's spine. He spoke of the Clan del Golfo's ties to high-ranking military officials, Congress members, and regional politicians, detailing how the cartel financed elections and paid generals for their blindness. He recounted joint operations with the military against leftist guerrillas and how state structures used his militiamen for dirty work. It was a desperate attempt to become a witness too valuable to extradite, an effort to lance the boil of corruption for his own salvation. However, Washington had no intention of waiting for Colombian justice to drown in Otoniel's depositions. Pressure from the USA was colossal. The Americans demanded his head not for justice in Colombia, but for a show trial of the man who had flooded their streets with hundreds of tons of cocaine. Colombia's Supreme Court, despite protests from cartel victims demanding the executioner be tried at home, sanctioned the extradition. On May 4, 2022, Otoniel was taken from his cell wearing a helmet and bulletproof vest, placed on a DEA plane, and sent to New York. The images of the once omnipotent king of Urabá, looking out the porthole with tears in his eyes, bidding farewell to his homeland, became the symbol of the myth of untouchability crumbling. But as the plane flew north, radio transmissions ordering revenge were already echoing through Colombia's jungles. The system built by Otoniel, decentralized, networked, and autonomous, did not collapse with its creator's fall. It simply switched to war mode, preparing to demonstrate to the state that the Hydra's severed head was merely a pretext for the birth of new, hungrier monsters. The drug agency plane carrying Dairo Antonio Usuga to New York had barely touched down on American soil when Colombia received a response that sobered it like a shotgun blast to the face. The euphoria in the presidential palace, Casa de Nariño, where officials were toasting the end of the Clan del Golfo, shattered against cruel reality just hours after the extradition. On May 5, 2022, as if a switch had been flipped, the country's north plunged into a silence more terrifying than any bombardment. The beast's revenge began, a coordinated, ruthless, and total action that went down in history as the largest paro armado armed strike in the last decade. Those who believed the king's arrest would decapitate the organization made a fatal error, underestimating the level of discipline and structural vitality that Otoniel had embedded in his empire's DNA. The cartel did not disintegrate into rival factions. Instead, it clenched into a single fist and struck not at military bases, but at the state's most vulnerable point, its economy and citizens' sense of security. Over 4 days, from May 5th to May 9th, 11 departments of Colombia, a territory larger than many European countries, found themselves hostage to a criminal syndicate. From Antioquia to La Guajira, from Chaco to Santander, AGC militiamen took to the streets with canisters of gasoline and lighters. They stopped trucks, buses, taxis, and even motorcycles, forced drivers out at gunpoint, and set the vehicles ablaze directly on the roads. Black smoke from burning tires and car carcasses became the region's new flag. According to official and significantly underestimated figures, more than 180 vehicles were burned during those days. This was not mere vandalism, but a surgically precise attack on the country's logistical arteries. The roads connecting the Caribbean coast ports with the interior ground to a halt. Cargoes of food rotted in truck beds, gas supplies to remote villages ceased, and millions of people found themselves locked in their homes, afraid even to look out the window. The cities of Monteria, Sincelejo, and Apartado transformed into post-apocalyptic film sets. Streets emptied, schools, universities, banks, and hospitals closed their doors. Even street food vendors, living day to day, did not risk going out to work, knowing the price of disobedience was death. The Clan del Golfo demonstrated total social control. A WhatsApp message or the spray-painted graffiti, a GC presente, a GC here, on house walls was enough to paralyze life in entire regions. During those days, the state effectively disappeared. Police patrols, which just yesterday reported successes, barricaded themselves in stations, unable to guarantee security even in major district centers, let alone the deep rural provinces. It was a humiliating proof that the monopoly on violence, so often discussed by politicians in Bogotá, actually belonged to those who controlled the jungle. This paro armado became the most convincing argument against the kingpin strategy, the decapitation strategy championed by the U.S. and Colombia for decades. Otoniel's arrest not only failed to destroy the clan, but exposed its terrifying evolution. It turned out the organization had long surpassed the model of personal dictatorship. While Otoniel sat in jail, management shifted to a collective intelligence, the Estado Mayor, General Staff. This body, composed of expert field commanders, acted like the board of directors of a transnational corporation. Orders to initiate the strike, carry out targeted attacks, and subsequently lift the blockade were executed with military synchronicity by hundreds of cells scattered thousands of kilometers apart. It was a demonstration of force impossible to ignore. The cartel showed it could shut down the economy of a third of the country at will, and no army could prevent it. The economic damage from 4 days of terror was calculated in hundreds of millions of dollars, but the psychological blow was far more destructive. The population, promised freedom after the capture of the main villain, realized nothing had changed. In place of one monster, a faceless multi-headed hydra had emerged, even more cruel and unpredictable. While the government tried to downplay the catastrophe's scale in the media, local residents saw burning trucks and empty store shelves. The Clan del Golfo used this chaos to assert the power of new leaders, whose names until yesterday were known only to intelligence agencies and were now whispered in fear. The strike ended as abruptly as it began, on the Estado Mayor's order, but the message had been delivered. Otoniel's extradition was not the end of the war, but merely the conclusion of the first chapter. Ahead lay an era of new leaders who, having inherited a perfectly oiled death machine, prepared to use it at full power to prove their right to the throne. As the smoke from the trucks burned during the armed strike cleared and the echo of gunshots faded, an ominous silence fell within Colombia's most powerful criminal organization. It was the calm before the storm, but this time, the storm brewed not from outside, but from within. Otoniel's extradition left the throne vacant, and as often happens in the history of empires built on blood, the succession was settled not by vote, but by a knife in the back. Two figures emerged who embodied the schizophrenic nature of the Clan del Golfo: Yobanes de Jesus Avila, known by the almost comical nickname Chiquito Malo, Little Bad, and Wilmar Antonio Giraldo, who bore the battle name Siopas. These two were not mere rivals. They represented two different worlds fused in the crucible of Colombian violence. Chiquito Malo, a former paramilitary from the Bananeros bloc, was flesh and blood of the old AUC Guard, a pragmatic death manager who knew every screw in the drug trafficking machine. Siopas, conversely, was a deserter, a former fighter for the radical left FARC who brought partisan tactics and fanatical discipline to the far-right cartel. Over several months in 2022, this duumvirate, supported by a third heavyweight, José Gonzalo Sánchez, Gonzalito, attempted to maintain structural equilibrium. However, the logic of absolute power is inexorable. There cannot be two tigers on the same hill in the jungle. Siopas, responsible for military expansion in the Chaco department, was becoming too influential, too autonomous, and, according to the old guard, too leftist in his thinking. The tension, accumulated over months, resolved itself in the finest Machiavellian traditions. In February 2023, Ciopas was summoned to a commander's council at a camp in the Debeba Mountains. He was promised a discussion on strategy against government forces, but instead, a tribunal awaited him. The man who had spent years teaching others how to survive made a fatal mistake. He trusted his brothers in arms. Ciopas's body was found days later, dumped by the roadside like useless trash. There were no signs of combat on him. He had been killed by his own bodyguards, corrupted by Chiquito Malo. This murder became a turning point. It sent a clear and chilling signal throughout the structure. The era of collegiality was over. The dictatorship of the little bad had begun. Chiquito Malo, having consolidated power, conducted a vast purge within the mid-level ranks, eliminating anyone who expressed even the slightest sympathy for the slain competitor. The organization, it seemed, should have weakened due to internal strife, but paradoxically, it became only more monolithic. Freed from internal contradictions, the Clan del Golfo, under Chiquito Malo's sole command, entered a new phase of existence, the phase of invisible war. The new king learned from Otoniel's fate. While his predecessor allowed himself to relax surrounded by teenage girls and orthopedic mattresses, Chiquito Malo turned his life into an ascetic hell of constant movement. He banned the use of any electronics within a kilometer radius of his location. Orders were transmitted exclusively through a chain of trusted couriers, and meetings were held in remote jungle corners, the coordinates of which changed an hour before the rendezvous. But while personally foregoing gadgets, he filled the defense perimeter with technology. The cartel began mass purchasing civilian drones, transforming them into reconnaissance tools. Now, invisible eyes of the cartel hovered over police stations and military bases in Urabá, recording every movement of law enforcement. The clan created its own cyber intelligence, hacking police frequencies and databases, knowing raid plans before the helicopters even took flight. This internal reorganization coincided with an unprecedented external factor that literally flooded the cartel with money. The year 2023 became historic not only for political changes, but also for a botanical phenomenon. Colombia broke all imaginable records for coca production. According to UN data, areas cultivated with coca bushes exceeded 230,000 hectares. The market became saturated with raw material. Prices for cocaine paste in remote regions plummeted, pushing many small groups to the brink of bankruptcy. But for the Clan del Golfo, this became a golden age. Possessing gigantic cash reserves and controlling export corridors, Chiquito Malo began buying white gold at dumping prices, accumulating strategic reserves. The cartel acted as the central bank of the narco world, extending credit to farmers and buying harvests others couldn't sell. Gonzalito, becoming the new boss's right-hand man, ensured the uninterrupted operation of this assembly line. He ruthlessly suppressed any attempts by independent traffickers to operate outside the cartel's channels. At the ports of the Caribbean coast, a system of total corruption was established. Containers of bananas bound for Europe were loaded with cocaine with industrial efficiency. The Clan del Golfo ceased being merely an armed group. It transformed into a logistical giant capable of digesting a record coca harvest and spitting it onto the streets of Amsterdam, London, and New York in the form of billions of dollars in profit. This financial power allowed Chiquito Malo not only to restore military potential after arrests and purges, but also to expand the army, recruiting new fighters from the impoverished youth and Venezuelan migrants. By the end of 2023, the Clan del Golfo, having survived the loss of its leader and a bloody internal feud, appeared not as a dying beast, but as a predator that had just shed its old skin to become faster, meaner, and more dangerous. The state, which had hoped for the cartel's disintegration, realized with horror that instead of chaos, it had gained a perfectly structured, wealthy, and technologically advanced army poised for a long war of attrition. In August 2022, as Gustavo Petro, the first leftist president in Colombia's history, ascended the steps of the Casa de Nariño Palace, a tense anticipation reigned in the Urabá jungles. The new power arrived with an ambitious, almost utopian slogan, Paz Total, total peace. The idea was to sit down at the negotiating table with absolutely all armed actors, from the ideological ELN guerrillas to purely criminal syndicates. For the Clan del Golfo, this proposal became a gift from destiny, a Trojan horse they joyfully rolled through the gates of democracy. Chiquito Malo, a hardened cynic and tactician, instantly grasped the moment's essence. The state was offering a truce. He hired Bogotá's best lawyers to begin a complex legal game, arguing that the AGC was not a drug cartel but a political organization, a third force in the conflict, entitled to the same privileges and amnesty as the FARC guerrillas in 2016. However, while lawyers in expensive suits sipped coffee in ministerial offices debating terminology, militiamen in camouflage launched the largest offensive in 5 years. The truce, declared on the eve of 2023, proved to be a grand bluff. The Clan del Golfo indeed stopped shooting at police and the army, but only to free up resources for a total war against direct competitors. Using the regime of silence as a shield against aerial attacks, Chiquito Malo's units methodically began pushing the ELN partisans and FARC dissidents out of strategically important corridors. In the departments of Chaco, Sur de Bolívar, and Antioquia, a veritable massacre unfolded for control of gold deposits. Illegal gold, whose price hit historic records, became fuel for the cartel, allowing them to finance the war almost infinitely. Rivers poisoned by mercury from artisanal extraction carried the bodies of slain competitors, while Bogotá continued to talk about peace. The hypocrisy of total peace reached its zenith in March 2023, during the so-called miners' strike in the Bajo Cauca region. What was presented as a protest by simple prospectors against the destruction of dredges was, in reality, a special operation by the clan. Militiamen, mingling with the crowd, burned ambulances, blocked oxygen supplies to hospitals, and closed roads, demanding the government halt operations against illegal mining. It was state-level blackmail. Petro, realizing he was being duped, was forced to suspend the truce in several regions, but the time was lost. In 6 months of negotiations, the Clan del Golfo managed to regroup, fill its arsenals with state-of-the-art weapons, and recruit thousands of new recruits from Venezuelan migrants and unemployed youth. As of today, the statistics are frightening in their monumentality. The Clan del Golfo has transformed into a leviathan controlling, according to the most conservative intelligence estimates, over 30% of Colombia's territory. This encompasses nearly 300 municipalities where the commander's word carries more weight than the Constitution. Their numerical strength has surpassed 9,000 individuals, more than half of whom are so-called puntos, and a civilian support network permeating society from the bottom up. They have created a parallel state that not only punishes but also cares, building roads where there is no asphalt, bringing electricity to abandoned villages, and distributing school kits to children bearing the AGC logo on their covers. It is the classic hearts and minds strategy, bought with cocaine dollars, turning the local population into a human shield for the narco barons. It is no longer simply an exporting cartel. The Clan del Golfo has also monopolized the domestic market, the so-called micro-trafficking, making entire generations of Colombians in poor neighborhoods dependent on cheap bazuco, unrefined cocaine. Their tentacles extend across the Atlantic. Ties with the Ndrangheta, the Albanian mafia, and Mexican cartels have transformed the organization into a key node of the global criminal economy. Intercepting cocaine submarines or arresting mid-level operatives no longer causes substantial damage to the system. The structure, created by Otoniel and perfected by Chiquito Malo, possesses terrifying regenerative capabilities. A severed head is immediately replaced by 2 new ones, and tomorrow, a graduate from a prestigious university arrives to replace an arrested accountant ready to work for the corporation. The story of the Clan del Golfo is a grim mirror of modern Colombia, reflecting how ideological warfare mutated into pure distilled greed. They began as defenders against communism and ended as the continent's largest slave traders and ecological terrorists. This monster survived the disintegration of the AUC, weathered the hunt for its leaders, adapted to the pandemic, and now uses the government's peace initiatives as a tool for expansion. Hopes that total peace will force them to lay down arms melt away daily. Why surrender when you have already won? Why seek amnesty when you are the law? We have come a long way from the first shootings in the banana groves of Urabá to the present day, where cartel drones monitor police patrols. This story teaches us that evil does not disappear, it merely changes form, becoming more perfect and invulnerable. The Clan del Golfo is the ideal predator of the globalization era, and as long as there is demand for white powder in European and U.S. nightclubs and gold bars and bank vaults, this heart of darkness will beat, pumping blood into money. This war is far from over, and its outcome concerns not only distant Latin America, but each of us. Because every dollar spent on a dose transforms into a bullet somewhere in the Chaco jungle. How do you think it's possible to defeat such a structure by force of arms? Or is the world condemned to coexist with this state within a state? Write your opinion in the comments. It's an important discussion that cannot be ignored. And if this in-depth analysis has opened your eyes to the true dimensions of the tragedy, be sure to give it a like and subscribe. We will continue to tell the truth, however uncomfortable it may be.